Hello, and welcome to my analysis of the last episode of Season 1 of The Handmaid's Tale. My name is Zachary Mahoney, and I'll be discussing, amongst other things, the prevalent themes that are apparent in the last 10 minutes, and also touching on a bit of what happened in previous parts of this episode, giving its bearing on the evident conclusion. Moreover, I'll also be discussing works such as Joseph Campbell's, insofar as it relates to the hero's journey and how the protagonist, in her own way, fulfills some of the prophecies that are outlined in such theories of literature. So, more specifically, how the protagonist in The Handmaid's Tale finds an elixir of sorts that resolves some of the interpersonal conflicts and the struggle with the overarching patriarchal structure of the society that she's obviously living in. Now, before discussing some of the points that I just touched on, I'd like to focus on a scene that struck me the most as far as drawing parallels to the overarching narrative structure, really, of the entire season itself, and that's the image that's on your screen right now. Now, as many of you will know that have watched the entire season, this is not the first time that we have seen the handmaids, the girls themselves, doing what is called a reaping, where there is an idea of communal justice, and if one person in that society, here's another image showing, of course, the reason behind why this reaping doesn't go as planned per se, and this is mainly because the group is actually being forced to punish one of their own, which is not something that happened in the previous idea of the reaping. So consequently, because of this now new representation of the reaping and the contingencies in which the girls are supposed to act, we see what starts to become the confrontation or the pinnacle almost of this episode's story arc, insofar as it touches on the conflict between the overarching patriarchal structure of the society at large and the girls themselves, and that also microstructure that's present. So what obviously becomes evident is that these girls are not going to attack one of their own, and this act of pitting one against one another, which we really haven't seen before, to this degree at least, is, for lack of a better term, the straw that broke the camel's back, right? We see that at moments after this that the girls, starting with the protagonist, drop the stone and refuse to stone one of their fellow handmaids to death. And this, of course, sparks them being dismissed, walking triumphantly, I would say, which is a juxtaposition to what we have seen in previous scenes of the handmaids walking down the street. They're walking quite triumphantly, quite confidently, with the decision they've made, because they feel as though they've stood up, at least to some degree, to that overarching systemic patriarchal structure that is keeping them where they are. So, with all this in mind, as far as looking at how the writers have structured this episode, it becomes quite interesting, because we now see that they're not so interested in necessarily a linear progression of a story. I mean, we've seen that with the flashbacks that have been prevalent also throughout um, the show. But with a scene such as this, it really shows especially when you juxtapose the first reaping, right? Like, who were they trying to attack? Like, who were they? Who was the justice supposed to be imposed on? Well, it was a criminal. It was an alleged rapist and someone who physically abused one of the handmaids. So, also us from a viewer's perspective, there's a little more sympathy there, right? I mean, if we are to take what what those crimes, those alleged crimes were, face value, then if that man is guilty of that, you could see the sympathy that, maybe not so much respect what the girls do in that way, but you can at least sympathize for the passion and rage they have, because they've been almost as as a paramilitary, or just a military training of sorts, right? Like they've gone through so much together, and they have this camaraderie, I should say, um, that really links them as, they're not strangers as they once were. And we saw this progression obviously in those flashbacks earlier in the show itself, and we've seen that they've had to go through brutal abuse, verbally and physically, to get where they are. So their viciousness, or what could be perceived as viciousness in the first reaping, is not so surprising, I would say, to the viewers, and neither is it really when we see them having to turn on one of their own, right? I really don't think that people would look at that scene and say, well, they're so indoctrinated and brainwashed that they're going to brutally stone someone that they had just cared for, right? That, like, that specific handmaid had been particularly important in the entirety of the show, especially when we see her gradual change of her total character from when we were first introduced to her, and then her breaking of her psyche, right? So there's that sympathy there. So to think that those girls are going to turn on her, I think from a viewer's perspective, would be quite naive. So it's quite interesting how the writers have integrated these two reapings that are so different and juxtaposed, but yet get a similar. They create a similar inclination in the viewers. They're able to somewhat project the resolution of that scene. So, with all this in mind, and with respect to the writing, um, the two reaping scenes in particular show or emphasize as well, and display one of the most prevalent themes that continued throughout the entire show, which is that of power, right? We see in the second reaping that the handmaids are subverting this idea of power, within the society that they are living. Instead of following through with the orders, they don't do it. So there's that active subversion, that there's no mistake that's there in that last bit of the last episode, right? It shows the amount of sheer effort it has taken the girls to even just communally do an act as simple as dropping a rock, right? It places just so much importance on at what some would say is a small gesture, but when you have this overarching framework of the society, and how much this theme of power, right, has been hammered into not only the characters, the handmaids, and the viewers as well, but into the writing. So with also this theme of power comes this new theme that I would argue is still prevalent in certain areas of the show, but I think the theme of feminism, right, in that moment, that idea that it's not just one person, right? It's not just one character that's creating, the protagonist herself, like Offred is starting, you know, but the parallels to contemporary and also just to historical feminism with that scene is immense, right? You have one person, or you have maybe a smaller group of people coming together that need to breach that fold, so to speak. So I think personally that in that last 10 minutes, and especially in that scene in particular, where they're pitted against one of their own, we see this theme of feminism come to the forefront, which is quite spectacular. Now, with regards to Joseph Campbell's work, and more specifically his writing on the hero's journey,
we see that there's many parallels between The Handmaid's Tale and what he writes about. So more specifically, with regards to how a protagonist goes about their own journey throughout a narrative, we see that the protagonist of The Handmaid's Tale similarly finds herself in a situation where she now has access to an elixir of the gods. Now, obviously, this isn't supposed to be taken literally, but more metaphorically. So, for example, she finds the courage in herself to drop the stone and not participate in the reaping. She also finds that package of letters, right, that has the potential to completely disrupt and destroy the patriarchal system that she lives in. And also, I would suggest that when she gets into the car in the last several minutes and is taken away, you don't see her crying or upset or frustrated. Instead, she seems to be quite content in a way of what her actions have led her to. And I would also suggest that this, in and of itself, represents this form of Christian eschatology similar to what theologians would call kenosis, or self-emptying. And this is most presented in one of the last lines of season 1, where she says, "Whether this is my end or a new beginning, I have no way of knowing. I have given myself over into the hands of strangers because it can't be helped. And so I step up into the darkness within, or else the light." So when she says, for example, that she's given herself up, or given herself over, I should say, this draws parallels to what I was just suggesting, the Christian eschatology of kenosis. Lately I've been hard to reach. I've been too long on my own. Everybody